The Switch 2 has taken some flack since its announcement for not having enough of that Nintendo whimsy, that weird charm. Where's the Nintendo that put 2 screens on a handheld? Where's the Nintendo that handed you a sideways NES controller and said, here, it's got motion controls, play tennis? Why is the Switch 2 just a Switch with better graphics? Y'all, it has a mouse. Like, straight out of the box, it has a mouse. Like, every Switch 2 owner will have a mouse for every one of their Switch 2 games. I feel like this concept is in general being undersold, and that it is, in fact, a massive tectonic shift in the history of console gaming. But if you feel like that's an overstatement, that's fine, because that gives you and I something to talk about. I'm John Reardon, you're watching NWR TV. Join me for a deep dive into why mouse support might just be the most important feature of the Switch 2. Now, there are a couple of comments I usually hear when I try to explain why this matters so much. One is that this isn't the first time a Nintendo console has had a mouse, and the other is that other modern platforms, such as the Xbox Series X and S, already support keyboard and mouse. So, what's special about Switch 2? Now, both of those things are true. The Super Nintendo had a mouse that could be used on specific games, and you can indeed plug a USB mouse into an Xbox and use it to play a surprisingly large portion of that catalog. In fact, the Switch 1 had some third-party mouse peripherals that I actually covered back when they came out. So yeah, the idea of a mouse for a console game is by no means new. But the thing that all of those implementations have in common, all the way from Super Nintendo up to Xbox Series X, is that they're peripheral devices. When you crack open a brand new Xbox, it comes with a standard Xbox controller. Same for the Super Nintendo back in the day. That mouse and keyboard attachment for Switch I mentioned is something you have to seek out. But for Switch 2, that mouse is the pack-in controller. It's not even some separate included attachment, it is literally your basic controller. If I'm developing a game, I have to program it assuming the player will have what came in the box with their system. If I start requiring extra peripherals, it creates a barrier of entry for my game. How many of you looked at Skylanders, Disney Infinity, or less realistically, Starlink Battle for Atlas, but were scared off by the sheer quantity of extra stuff you needed just to play the game? That's why generally these sorts of products are sold in bundles, because unlike a regular controller, you can't assume your player has this weird attachment. And if I'm a developer working on some other game, I'm certainly not going to build a function of my game to be prerequisite on a Disney Infinity portal, because what are the odds that my intended player even has one? As a result, these accessories are built for individual games and come at a huge risk for the developer. If your game doesn't catch on, then you're also out the production cost of your portal, controller attachment, or plastic instrument. For every big success like Guitar Hero, there's also that Tony Hawk skateboard thing. So now let's take something as simple as a mouse, something much more commonplace than a controller that looks like a DJ's turntable. Maybe I want to bring my PC-focused real-time strategy game to a console. Even if I'm porting to Xbox, which has a huge crossover with PC and has great support for those peripherals like a USB-based mouse, the best I can do is make an optional mouse mode, knowing that the vast majority of my players won't use it. Instead, the primary mode of play needs to be a controller, and for some games, like RTS, that just isn't the best way to play. So now, my default experience is an inherently inferior experience. And that's no matter how much honest effort I put in. The console port of Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition, for example, is probably the best console RTS port I've ever played. So much work went into making that game viable and competitive on a controller. But at the end of the day, some games just work better with a mouse. Just like I would argue that some games work better with a controller. The unique twist for Switch is that every player has a mouse. Do you still need to provide controller support? Well, yeah, you probably should, but it doesn't necessarily need to be your default. And so if the controller configuration isn't as good, that's okay, because that doesn't have to be the way most of your players will experience the game. And if they do, it's because they chose to play it that way, rather than missing out because they didn't have a peripheral. It's a bit like Nintendo bringing motion-controlled games like Skyward Sword to Switch. The motion controls are still there, and in my opinion, they are the better way to play that game because they're what it was designed for. But if you choose to play with traditional controls, you can, and that's fine. But this fundamental shift in what the default console player has access to blasts open the restrictions on what kind of games are viable for console. We've already seen that Civilization 7 is getting a Switch 2 release with mouse support, and in much the same vein, I expect to see a lot of PC real-time strategy games make the jump. The one I already mentioned, Age of Empires, seems like a good bet given its success on Xbox and its port to PlayStation 5. It wouldn't be the first time the series has graced a Nintendo platform. There was a Nintendo DS version back in the day, but it would be the first time it made it over with its real-time gameplay intact. Speaking of RTS games that have been on Nintendo platforms before, both StarCraft and Command & Conquer could, in theory, appear on Nintendo for the first time since the Nintendo 64. But getting out of the RTS genre, Nintendo fans are already big proponents of motion control support for their shooters, which tends to be more competitive with mouse and keyboard than a standard controller. But now that gap could be eliminated entirely. Nintendo themselves are already pushing this in their own first-person adventure title, Metroid Prime 4. And speaking of adventure games, I could see point-and-click adventures, both classic and new, getting a fresh chance at life on Switch 2. Maybe Cyan's excellent Myst and Riven remakes could arrive with full mouse support. And yes, I'm sure Nintendo will make plenty of their own uses for the mouse. We've already seen some of this, and I expect games like Mario Maker and Splatoon to take full advantage of it. Perhaps we'll even get Mario Paint on NSO, but what I'm most excited for is third parties to rethink what experiences are viable for home consoles. Integrated mouse support could have huge ramifications for the Switch 2 library on a level that I'm not sure most of us have fully realized yet. It's incredibly exciting, and the PC-focused indie developers I've already spoken with seem very interested in what that could mean for games they'd previously written off as PC only. We'll have to wait and see exactly how it plays out, but it's definitely something that we'll want to be watching for. In the meantime, I'm curious if there are any PC games that you'd like to see make the jump to Switch 2 with mouse support in mind. And if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to Nintendo World Report TV. You can check out a whole lot more at NintendoWorldReport.com, and you can join our Discord to chat with us about this or anything else Nintendo related using the link in the description. Once again, my name's John Reardon, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.